So we are now up to our third week in this series about Sabbath. And this is already the second time in this series that you've heard a version from the Ten Commandments used as one of the scripture texts. Boat also used a very similar text a couple weeks ago. His was from the Exodus version of it. And in the Exodus version, the reason for the Sabbath was given as, because the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and everything that is in them in 6 days, but rested on the seventh day. That is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Sabbath there in Exodus is linked to the creation poem. It's a reminder that this is a God who is immensely creative, but that creativity is not just perpetual productivity for the sake of constantly growing. It's a God who gets to the point of supporting relationships with humans and then says, okay, that's very good, it's time to rest. So the Sabbath is to remember the presence of that kind of loving God in the world that was created as very good. And what is the most clear and the same between the two versions of the Ten Commandment texts is what we are supposed to do. That's rest. And that was Marlene's topic last week. So the Sabbath is a reminder of the worth of humanity and that we need to take care of ourselves, which includes regular rest. And our worth, our being loved by that creative God, is simply in our humanity, not in any productivity. And I recap those ideas with my own little spin on them because I think they are the important basis to continue building to this week's topic, which was Sabbath as resistance. So here's another big idea that is in both versions of the Sabbath command. The command to rest applies to everybody. It's for you, it's for your children, your servants, your animals, and immigrants living among you. The Deuteronomy version even repeats the servant part a second time, in case you didn't catch it the first. And I think we need to pause for a second to recognize that that's the radical part. It's never been radical that those who have wealth and power, that they can take regular rest. A quote that I saw going around social media said, "Modern luxury is the ability to think clearly, sleep deeply, move slowly, and live quietly in a society designed to prevent all four." Rest is often presented as a luxury for those with enough privilege to get away with it. And this leads into how the Deuteronomy text then diverges the most from the Exodus one. Because once we get to why the Sabbath is commanded, it's a completely different reason. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt, but the Lord your God brought you out of there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. That's why the Lord your God commands you to keep the Sabbath day. So the Exodus version links it back to the creation poem and God's rest. This one links the idea of Sabbath to the story of God rescuing the people from slavery in Egypt, a time when they could not rest. And like Byron was talking about in the children's time, God here essentially says, you cannot do that to yourselves again, and you cannot inflict it on others again. The inclusion of having servants and immigrants and even animals in this rest helps to explicitly discourage using this as like a religious rule that makes it easier to exploit others. It is not, I have to rest, therefore you, slave, should be doing all the work for me. That would be easy and common, and it would be just another way for those with the privilege to rest to push down on those who don't have that privilege. It would be just the same as what Egypt had done to them, but now they're on top instead of on the bottom. So instead, the command says, I have to rest, and I have to honor your rest, especially if you have less power than me, like a servant or an immigrant. It is a statement of resistance to the way of Pharaoh that God had just freed them from. So let's follow that reference in this Deuteronomy version back to what they're being told to remember, that time as slaves in Egypt. So I went back to start at Exodus 1, because I figured if I wanted to read about the Exodus, I'd start at chapter 1. And there's a big idea in here that I had overlooked in some other times reading it. Sometimes you don't notice things until you really start to sit with it for a sermon, and then it starts to feel more obvious in hindsight. It's honestly one of the best things about doing this once or twice a year. But the entire explanation for why Pharaoh decided to enslave a whole group of people was because he was afraid of them. The Israelites weren't doing anything scary, as far as the text says at least. There is no inciting incident mentioned of the Israelites first expressing some desire to overthrow the Egyptian leadership. But Pharaoh got scared that there were, quote, too many people who were different than him. And without any more reason than that, he becomes afraid that he will no longer hold all the power over them. And he did what anybody who's driven by fear of losing power does. He tries to reassert that power by flexing it again against them. You know, it's kind of like when one world leader points out that another world leader is unreliable and just likes to throw power around to benefit himself. And then that second world leader responds with new threats and publicly kicking the first world leader out of the club of only those super cool leaders who gave the second world leader money and promised not to say mean things about him. The second world leader is kind of proving the first world leader's point. Obviously, that's purely hypothetical. It's definitely not the kind of thing that happens every day now. Anyway, when throwing power around doesn't work to calm Pharaoh's fears, he escalates even more, and the Egyptians started looking at the Israelites with, quote, disgust and dread. In other words, they start viewing them as less human and needing to be enslaved. And it was all because Pharaoh was afraid that the mere presence of difference would threaten his power. Those who already have a lot of power and privilege are often terrified of human difference and try hard to convince us that we should be too. Because they cannot imagine a world that is not governed by a desire to rule over those who are different. And that means that difference itself is a threat that requires escalating violence to contain it. They might think they will be happy and feel secure as soon as they get a little bit more control, but they never will, because the real problem was never people being different. It was their fear. And now they've put themselves in this cycle of becoming increasingly afraid, not less afraid. So as we proceed forward to chapter 5, we see another related factor in Pharaoh's motivation. He makes the Israelites produce just as many bricks, but refuses to give them any straw to be able to do it. And there are a couple ways that we could read this. My first instinct was to assume, well, there's no way Pharaoh actually believes that they would be able to produce just as much, but with less resources, right? He must just be doing it to be cruel. Like, that's pretty textbook bullying behavior. You punch down on somebody else to feel stronger by comparison. And we see a lot of that in the news too. Then I remember how this all started with fear of difference leading to that dehumanization. And in Exodus 5:9, after Moses and Aaron have asked basically just for a weekend off to be able to go worship God, Pharaoh says to make the men's work so hard that it's all they can do and they can't focus on these empty lives. He wants to scrub away any kind of humanity that they are still trying to claim, any reason for their existence, like a God that cares about them. He wants them to only exist to make bricks for his profit. So now we see how the dehumanization and the seeking of more power, they go hand in hand. And this cycle might get started from either direction, but once it starts, the two pieces can keep feeding into each other. And it makes me think maybe Pharaoh really did believe that he could squeeze out a little bit more profit. Because if the Israelites aren't really human in his eyes anyway, if they exist purely for his gain, then why not save a little bit more by not providing materials? That does seem consistent with Pharaoh's mindset. It's also consistent in how a lot of big corporations will act today, trying to sap out every bit of value to pay off their shareholders, no matter how much it hurts customers. And this feedback loop of fear and rationalizing hurting others for profit, that's the easiest to see looking at the wealthiest among us, because you don't get to be super rich without exploiting some people along the way. And the more you exploit, the more detached you become, and the more comfortable it is to do it even more. But that's not just a problem for the super rich, that is a temptation for all of us. And in fact, in many cases, in order for those super rich to be able to profit off the works of others, they need the rest of us to operate off of a similar mindset. So we get a lot of effort and a lot of money thrown at us to try to suck us further into that destructive loop, to try to convince us that we need to play that same game of climbing over others to get to the top. We will get the politicians and the think tanks pushing the narrative that we need to be afraid of anybody who's different than us. We are assured that it is okay, probably even good, to hurt those other people. And we'll also get a lot of advertising telling us how we are not complete if we don't pursue having more power and more wealth for ourselves. Those ads now in the internet age will even be personalized. They'll be mining from a couple decades of tracking everything you've been doing online to make sure they target your deepest insecurity the closest they can. If you just buy this, your life will be better. Don't slow down. Don't consider that it means you'd have less to share it generously with other people who might need it more. Don't even think about other things that might be a higher priority for yourself. And Sabbath is one act of resistance to this, but I'll briefly put on my tech person hat to say, so is installing an ad blocker on your devices. Seriously, do that. And even the concept of rest itself can get hijacked to further the push for more productivity. Some of the smarter managers might say that, well, if you need a break, of course, you should be able to have one within reason, but that's primarily so that you can be more productive later. We need rest because that's actually how we get the most done in the long run. And this argument goes all the way back at least to Aristotle. It is also scientifically true. That is how we get the most work done in the long run. But I think that argument comes up short of the picture of Sabbath that's being painted in the Bible. I think that's still the Pharaoh mindset, that we exist primarily for production. It's just with that a little extra note about how do we optimize that production. And Abraham Joshua Heschel, in his classic work on the Sabbath, said the same. Heschel argues that to the biblical mind, however, labor is the means toward an end, and the Sabbath as a day of rest, as a day of abstaining from toil, is not for the purpose of recovering one's lost strength and becoming fit for the forthcoming labor. The Sabbath is a day for the sake of life. The biblical framing of the Sabbath flips the more productivity version completely on its head. We don't observe Sabbath for the sake of being more productive. We are productive for the sake of being able to observe Sabbath, where that is where we have a chance to resonate with our true humanity and the humanity of others. And just as Pharaoh tried to cut away the humanity of the Israelites, there are a lot of pressures on us to strip away our own humanity. We are constantly encouraged in ways both subtle and sometimes obvious to just be good producers and consumers. Like Pharaoh said, we are supposed to work so hard that it's all we can do. And we can't focus on ideas like a God who loves us just as we are and wants to liberate us from oppression. And Jesus offered some wisdom about trying to reclaim some humanity in the face of this destructive cycle as well, including in the Matthew 6 text. And he says, instead of thinking with that scarcity mindset of always being worried about not having enough and trying to get it from others, God offers abundance. God provides enough for the birds of the air, the grass, the lilies, and will do the same for you. It's a reaffirmation of the creation poem's claim that God made the world very good, even before we started all of our wealth accumulation empires. And in one sense, this seems like very simple and straightforward advice. There are two opposing things. One of them is destructive. The other affirms our humanity and the humanity of others around us. You should pick the good one. And sometimes I think that the Bible's language makes stuff like this sound too straightforward. Or similarly, in a lot of churches, I was reminded recently, one of the common baptismal vows is something about renouncing Satan and all his works. And sometimes I think there's just not enough nuance about good and evil and the complexities of the world in that kind of language. But then sometimes I also hear the latest update on the authoritarian police state that's conducting kidnappings, torture, murder, the dismantling of every human right that we hold dear. And I see resistance to this reality, like thousands of people out in minus 26 Celsius Minneapolis weather. In one location, there were about 100 clergy who were simply kneeling and praying out in the freezing cold until they got arrested. And moments like that make me think that sometimes it really can be that clear what it looks like to renounce Satan and all his works. We need the nuance, and certainly we need the love for enemies when we're talking about specific people who are caught up in those evil systems. And we saw some of that this week as well with the first responder who saved the life of the ICE agent who had captured her and then was promptly captured again. But we also need this unashamed clarity in renouncing those evil systems too. And Sabbath is one of our tools to do that renouncing. And I think there's actually a pretty good argument that Friday's general strike and protests in Minneapolis was maybe the best embodiment of this component of Sabbath that I've ever seen, because they chose to sacrifice work productivity and some chance of personal comfort inside to go out and reclaim their humanity and the humanity of those who are being attacked the most. They chose to set aside all of those reasons why they could have opted out. And this shows that it isn't a simple, well, just choose the better way. That must have been very hard. I had a hard enough time walking from the bus stop to work in the cold on Friday. And it wasn't even as cold here as it was there, and it was a much shorter time. And this is also slow work. It won't always look like progress immediately. But one essential component of what makes all that really hard and slow work possible is that they did it together. At minimum, you're going to need to be able to fight this battle against that fear, that dehumanization, alongside others who are trying to do the same. And Sabbath and church are not strictly the same thing. They're not even the same day of the week. Plus, for a church like ours that relies on a lot of volunteers every week, it often doesn't really feel like rest. And Marlene touched on a lot of this really well last week, including doing a good job challenging that maybe we need to expand our definition of rest a little bit, especially with the focus on relationships. But like Sabbath, what church can do is remind us of a few important ideas, like that there is a creative God that loves us just as we are and provides enough for us. Church can also get very practical, helping us with things like how do we align our budgets with our real values? Those are conversations that you could have in churches. Or for me as a tech guy, it might be helping you with things like that ad blocker again, or finding alternatives to relying on US big tech companies. That's one I've been thinking about a lot lately. And of course, I will not always get it right, and you won't always get it right, and we as a collective will not always get it right. Sometimes we are going to hurt ourselves and other people along the way when we fall back into those traps of fear and scarcity. And sometimes we'll find ourselves going along with that oppressive system because it's those other people who we barely think of as human that are the ones being hurt, not our people. Sometimes we will forget the way of Sabbath and we'll fall back into this way of Pharaoh. And when that happens, we are lovingly invited back into Sabbath again and into community again. We are invited back toward a God that loves us in all of our messy and sometimes unproductive humanity. There's a reason why Sabbath is a weekly discipline. It's not a one-time miracle fix. Because we still need those regular reminders as much as ever. Those temptations are realities of our world today just as much as they were at the time the laws about Sabbath were being handed down. If anything, it all seems to be going faster by the year. The world often demands that we move fast and break things, to reference an old Facebook mantra. And in the face of these realities, Sabbath becomes an act of resistance. It is a way of saying no to those things that we desperately need to say no to. Sabbath can remind us of the slower but much more important work of being human together. Maybe instead of moving fast and breaking things, the way of God often looks a lot more like moving slowly and fixing things